Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our last talent webinar of 2022. My name is Catherine Kennedy. I'm the Managing Director of P2P recruitment here in New South Wales. And really happy to round out the year with a webinar specifically focused on the New South Wales market. So I'm sure you'll get some interesting insights and takeaways from today that will help potentially in your job search as you head into 2023. So before we go on, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on right now, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So like I said, thank you for joining us. Today is specifically focused around New South Wales. We can say this because we're here in New South Wales and a bit biased, but the powerhouse of the Australian economy, I think. Yeah, certainly good to share some insights around what's happening specifically in our state. It's an interesting time in the employment market, and happy to take you through some of what our experiences have been as the year draws to its conclusion. So the plan today is I will give a bit of an overview around the state of the jobs market and the state of the economy here in New South Wales, and then we're going to talk to three people from the New South Wales team, really experienced consultants who've got particular areas of expertise, and they're going to essentially take us through different parts of that job searching process. So we're going to speak first to James Dalton, who'll talk about really planning for your job search and the things that you should consider as you're really approaching that job searching phase. We're then going to speak to Maddie Liang, who will take us through really how to prepare for interviews and that interviewing process. It's very much a world where virtual interviews are quite commonplace now, so there'll be some insights and some advice around how to navigate those. And then finally, Farah Sharif from our Western Sydney team will really round that out by giving some ideas around what you should do after the interview and some of the steps that you take to maximise your chances of securing that role that you're really keen to get. So that's the plan for today. Hopefully there'll be, I expect there'll be some questions that come up for you as we go on. What I think will be easier, if I could just ask you to, certainly you can put your questions in the chat, as they come to mind, but we'll have a Q&A session at the end just to make sure that we can sort of have a flow and make sure that we're not jumping around too much. But certainly add your questions as and when they come to your head, so that we can go back and address them as we get towards the end of the webinar. So that's the plan of attack. We might get straight into it with just a market update that I'll take you through of the New South Wales market. Okay, so as I said at the top of the conversation, New South Wales really is the powerhouse economy of Australia. Some of our colleagues in other states might say that they're challenging that, but certainly New South Wales has strengthened our position as the strongest and largest economy in Australia throughout 2022. More than $500 billion is the size of the New South Wales economy, which accounts for around a third of the nation's economic output, and more than, or just on a third of Australians live in New South Wales. So certainly accounts for a very large part of the Australian workforce. And as a result, no surprise that a lot of the jobs that are advertised within Australia are within New South Wales. So as of October of this year, 32% of job advertisements are now New South Wales based. What's interesting, I don't have data on this, but it is interesting in the advent of now more remote working, that some of the opportunities in regional parts of New South Wales, there are more employment opportunities than there would have been historically, just because there's the option to do some remote working. The unemployment rate in New South Wales, it peaked to 7.2 in mid-2020 in the sort of depths of lockdown. As of October 2022, it's dropped to 3%, so a very marked difference in the unemployment rate over that time, and still under the national unemployment rate, which is currently at 3.4%. So that just gives you a bit of a, a macro view of what's happening in the New South Wales economy. Low unemployment and lower than the national unemployment rate, which you could then surmise makes it, there's lots of opportunities around. There's been a lot of hiring activity in 2022 for sure. It's definitely been a busy market in terms of recruitment and the employment market. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's been easy to find the right job though, and I'm mindful there might be people who are on the webinar today who haven't been able to find quite the right thing, and we'll hopefully give you some advice as to how you might be able to secure that. But there has been a lot of hiring activity. If we jump to the next slide, and Jacob, who's behind the camera today, is actually managing this for us. So what you can see in front of us is just a summary of new jobs that have been advertised, and this data comes from Seek, which is, really sort of dominates that market in terms of employment advertising, and it shows the change that's happened month on month and year on year across the different states. And you can see in that left-hand table there, New South Wales has had a 22% year-on-year growth just in terms of the number of jobs that are being advertised in the market, but there has been a slight decrease month on month. So there's been a 4% decrease, and this data is from November. So from October through to November, it has contracted a little bit. I think that has there's a couple of factors there. One is just the time of year, and we typically start to see hiring sometimes can slow a little bit, but also just a bit of a normalising of the market. So there was a lot of pent-up demand for hiring earlier in the year, that the hiring that perhaps didn't happen throughout 2020 and 2021. We're now entering what I would call a more normal phase of the market. So contrasted, and you can see some of the other states there, Victoria, 26% year-on-year growth. Some of the other states were slightly less in terms of the growth, but still growth, except for just a handful that didn't have that growth. The industries where we're seeing the most significant change doesn't mean that they are the most dominant industries, as in that the most people working in these industries, but industries where we've seen the most significant change have been consulting and strategy, accounting, which is certainly an area that People does a lot of work in, and real estate and property. So the year-on-year growth just in accounting, you can see there is 25%. So if you're looking for work in that accounting area, which you may well be if you're engaged with People to People, the good news is there's more advertisements being advertised, 25% more than there were the same time last year. And the final table there is around the mix of full-time and part-time and casual work. So there's been growth really in all of those areas, except for that contract and temporary market. That's actually year on year has contracted a little bit, which I think reflects a preference for people to look for security. And we're certainly seeing sometimes what is initially a temporary opportunity might actually then become a permanent opportunity, once someone gets into that process. So if you jump to the next slide there, please, Jacob. This is around the percentage of the labour market across the different industries, and this is specifically for New South Wales. So contrasted to what we were talking about before, where there'd been the most growth, this is of the total New South Wales workforce where most people work, and it's from 2022, which is the light green sort of aqua kind of colour, and the royal blue is from February 2020. So healthcare and social assistance has the most number of employees. Professional, scientific and technical services is the next one. Retail, construction, and then education and training. So if you're a candidate and you're looking for work and thinking about the industries where there might just be the highest volume of opportunities, that would be something to consider. Obviously, you need to consider what your own skill set is as well, but they are the most dominant industries in terms of the largest number of employees within New South Wales. If you jump to the next slide, please, Jacob. This, I think, just gives a nice long-term kind of visual perspective of what's been happening with job ads within Australia. So this is Australia. This is not just New South Wales, but this is data from Seek, which goes way back to 2002. Forgive me for leaning in there. My eyes aren't as good as they once were. And you can see that it's been a little bit bumpy along the road there. A big dip down in 2020, as was to be expected. Sharp increase out, which is what we've experienced over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, and we're just starting to see it soften a little bit. But if you look at the last 10, 20 years, it's still the strongest market in terms of jobs advertised that we've seen in a number of decades, but just coming off a little bit from the absolute peak that we saw earlier this year. And I think I've got one more slide. I have two more slides, sorry. So something that's very topical in the market, or just in the media out there at the moment, is around wage growth. It's certainly something that's just part of the conversation a lot, certainly in the political sphere. So what is on screen there is the wage price index, and it's looking at the breakdown with the states and territories, and then the one on the right-hand side, and it's so small on my screen I can't see the numbers, but the one on the right-hand side just gives you a long-term trend around what's been happening with wages. So essentially, wages have been sitting between sort of 2 and 3% in terms of that wage price growth for a number of years. In New South Wales, it's now just over 3. I think it's at 3.1. And that's a long way from the inflation numbers that people are talking about of, approaching 8%. So it's definitely something that's very front of mind for employers and also for people when they're considering a change of employment. And I think, we have seen in the market, and certainly right now, a little bit of a disconnect at times between candidates wanting to use an opportunity to change jobs to get a big salary increase, or to get the salary increase they feel like they haven't been able to get in their existing role. Then employers are factoring in, rising costs for themselves. So one thing that we are certainly advising sort of both sides of this equation, so for people looking for work and also for employers, is to really think about what are the other things about the opportunity that provide benefit. So to you as a potential employee, is there flexible working? Do you get any other kind of benefits? Are there training opportunities? Is it a good career platform for you? And then equally from employers' perspective, to really be able to crystallise and articulate what those additional value adds are, because it can't necessarily be, there's not necessarily an alignment of expectations from candidates and what's actually being paid in the market in terms of wage price index. I think that this will continue to improve. It's certainly one of the reasons it's on the political agenda to try to lift wages in Australia. But at the moment, it's sitting, as I said, at around that 3 to 3.1% within New South Wales. And I have one final slide, and then we'll get into talking with the rest of the team. So anecdotally, I don't have data there, but just certainly, walking the floor in our different offices and talking to the team, these have been the roles that have really been in the most demand we've seen recently. So there's been quite a demand in that sales space, particularly sales acquisition, so business development, outbound sales type roles, and particularly with a technical sort of skill set. I know some of our sales recruiters have found that there's been a real appetite for, yes, sales skills, but there'll be a particular technical, expertise that employers are looking for. Busy again in that business support space, and this was an area that there wasn't as much hiring activity for a period of time, but we're definitely seeing a resurgence of demand for executive assistants, receptionists, those general administration sorts of positions, even on a temporary basis. They're starting to come back in. Customer service is definitely been an area where the team's been quite busy this year. Once again, there can be specific systems or industry expertise that employers are looking for. So it doesn't mean it's necessarily easy to secure these roles, but there's been a reasonable amount of activity. Across the accounting space, financial accountants, payroll, and credit roles have been particularly in demand. And then there's been HR and recruitment really across all levels. There's been a lot of activity reflecting that there's been a lot of hiring. Often someone's got to do the hiring. So that's why that's been relatively busy throughout all of 2022. Project roles, and there was some, a number of projects that perhaps didn't progress when times were a little bit more uncertain. And then 2022, there was budget and there was investment in projects again, and we've seen project roles coming through, and then procurement managers across that supply chain space as well. So that doesn't mean that's an exhaustive list. There's been, a really diverse number of roles that the team's worked on this year. And as I said, sometimes it might be a role function, but then there's a lot of other quite specific criteria. And we find often if an organisation engages with us, they want us to find someone who's got, the 10 things that they're looking for. They're quite specific around that criteria. So that hopefully just gives a little bit of a snapshot around what's been happening in New South Wales. In summary, it's been a very much busy year in the employment market. I would say it's starting to normalise a little bit now. But yeah, I expect that there will continue to be reasonably healthy hiring activity happening into 2023, which is hopefully a nice segue to talk to some of the people in the people-to-people team. That's a mouthful. Just to get some advice around how to approach that job search. So the first person we're going to talk to is James Dalton, and really what he's going to take us through is about how to approach that whole job searching process and what you should do when you're planning that. So I might step away for a minute and hand the reins over to James Dalton.
Thanks, Kath. Thanks, Kath. So I just wanted to start by tackling the start of your job search, because it can be a a daunting moment for candidates entering the market for the first time, perhaps in a number of years. And where I've found candidates have had the best or found the best matches in their job searches this year is from candidates who have taken the time to really reflect and understand their motivations and key priorities with their job search. And then those factors can include things like looking for a career development opportunity, taking like an additional step up in responsibilities or progressing to a leadership role. Other factors would include looking to make a change out of a particular industry and diversifying their skills. Sizes of business is also a reason that we commonly see. There could be a candidate looking to take on a role with a larger organization or even smaller one, depending on their preferences. Having the opportunity to work for a listed or multinational company. And then hybrid and flexible working arrangements has been extremely popular topic this year coming out of COVID and how businesses have adapted for their workforces. So that is certainly a factor that we're seeing with candidates looking to target companies who have given them the opportunity to work perhaps 2 or 3 days from home, or even location of the office generally is also a factor where candidates may be looking to seek something more convenient to, or closer to home with public transport or parking access. Salary remuneration, of course, has been really important as wages have generally increased across the board this year as demand has been really high in the market. One thing I would recommend though before starting your job search is to really explore the possibility of achieving a salary increase with your current employer first. If that is your main motivator for looking externally, I'd really recommend addressing that with your management team before then expanding your horizons elsewhere. Because if you're happy with everything else, like the company, your role, the industry you're in, if it really is just pinned down by salary, it's best to address that first before looking at other opportunities. And other things we hear would be workplace culture, management styles as reasons why candidates look to seek another move. So in terms of where I've, again, just alluding to candidates where I've found the best matches for candidates this year are ones that are able to be quite disciplined and stick to a combination of these priorities, perhaps in a 1, 2, 3 order as they work through the job process from interview, well, firstly finding out about the opportunity, applying, and then working through the first stage, second stage interview process. And if their values aren't aligned with their key criteria, it's best to walk away, because I've certainly seen candidates who have taken roles this year almost for a fear of missing out on a great employment market and have found themselves back in the market looking for another job because the position hasn't met their expectations of one of these factors. It has potentially, the role's been oversold to them, the location is harder to get to than they first realized, or the workplace culture isn't what they anticipated. So that's why I'd really recommend candidates taking the time at the start of their journey before they even start applying for positions to really reflect and understand what their key priorities are. Could we go to the next slide, Jacob? Another thing in conjunction with this sort of process of reflection, really you've got to use LinkedIn to maximize your connections out there and perhaps come across opportunities that you may not have even seen on the market through reconnecting with former managers, employees, executive teams. And in the accounting world, this could be audit partners or tax partners from accounting firms. It's just well worth reconnecting with people who have got the experience of seeing how you work and could recommend you potentially to opportunities, because certainly in the accounting space, an audit partner or a tax partner from a big 4 mid-tier firm is used by companies as partners and sounding boards for companies if they look to recruit in their team. So I'd really recommend using LinkedIn to reconnect with people and making sure your profile is up to date and ready to be approached by also recruitment consultants as well. I've filled roles recently in the last probably 2 or 3 months with candidates just initially from making contact on LinkedIn. So if that profile is not up to date, you're effectively closing the door potentially on opportunities that you didn't know were out there. The second point would be to definitely develop some trusted relationships with consultants. I hope people to people will be one of those. And this is a two-way relationship. So I'd recommend being open, transparent, and being honest about your key search criteria, so we can be in a position to try and match opportunities as close to what you're looking for as possible. So those would be my main takeaways. And the relationships with recruitment consultants will be in combination with your own direct applications that you're making on different job boards, because as Kath alluded to previously, when companies come out to partner with us, they have very high expectations often of candidates' backgrounds meeting all of or most of their desired criteria. So it's not always possible to help everybody that we meet with. So the relationships with us would be in combination with your own direct applications. So that's all for me. Back to you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, I think that just gives hopefully a bit of a framework and a structure to approach your job search through. And I think it can be quite overwhelming if you sort of thinking, oh, where do I start? So I think there's some good advice from James there. So following that sequence, if you've worked out, okay, what kind of roles am I going to apply for, and what are the things I need to consider when I'm I guess making that plan, then eventually you need to go and do some interviewing. So the next person we're going to speak to is Maddie Liang, and Maddie's going to talk to us a little bit about how to prepare for interviews and that virtual interview versus face-to-face interview as well. So over to you, Maddie.
Thanks, Kath. So yeah, today I am going to be talking about interviewing. So whether you should be meeting in person or virtually, and how best to prepare for an interview. So I guess since COVID, the way we interview and work has changed. As you can see, I'm working from home today. So I've been conducting meetings and interviews virtually. The number one benefit with interviews being virtual is speed. I can speak with someone in the morning and then interview them virtually in the afternoon. So it's definitely been a positive tool for us. However, now that restrictions have lifted and many people are back working in the office, we're definitely encouraging candidates to interview in person. It really allows you to make more of a personal connection with the hiring managers. And additionally, you'll be able to see the office and team that you're potentially working with and feel out the office culture as well. So if you're given the option to interview virtually or in person, I definitely encourage you to take the in-person option, meet the hiring managers face-to-face. In the long run, it definitely will be a really big advantage. So we're really trying to shift back to encourage candidates to interview in person. But I guess following on from what James has been seeking, so once you have done your research, prepared, and you're ready to start interviewing for jobs, I guess in terms of how to best prepare, the number one thing to do is always do your research. So no matter what, make sure you do your homework prior to your interview. In terms of research, you want to be looking up the company's name, their website, and learning a little bit about what they do. You're never expected to know the ins and outs of the business, but it's really good to have an understanding, be prepared if that question is asked. If the person or if the interview is in person, really need to know where you're going. So jump on Google Maps, see how you're going to get there, and make sure you're prepared. We do suggest to never arrive earlier than 5 minutes. The hiring manager has booked out a specific length of time. So they've allocated that space for you. You never want to arrive too early and be waiting in the room for them. So if you do arrive early, go for a coffee, have a walk around, and then come into the office 5 minutes before. It just sets a better impression than if you're waiting in the interview room for a long period of time for the hiring manager. So I guess the other thing that we're really stressing as well, if your interview is virtual, you still need to, be professional and appropriate. So biggest things to check when your interview is virtual is that your IT is working. So do a test run with a friend, make sure your camera and sound is clear, and make sure you're sitting in an appropriate place. You want to have a clear background that's free of inappropriate posters or materials. If you have to do your interview in your bedroom, please make sure your bed's not in the back. It's a funny thing to tell people, but it is just quite unprofessional. We're never going to sit in an interview in person in someone's bedroom. So you want to make sure your setting is still appropriate. So if you are in your bedroom, Microsoft Teams and Zoom have really good virtual backgrounds. So make sure you've done your testing to make the setting within your virtual interview be appropriate and just professional as well. If there is as well, if you have a house with housemates, live with your family, make sure they're aware that you're interviewing. You don't want anyone to be walking around in the background and distracting yourself either, so that you can be as, prepared and go as well as you can in the interview. I guess next thing we always go on to is presentation. So in terms of what you want to wear to an interview, dress to impress. It's always good to be in corporate attire, whether you're interviewing in person or at home, make sure you're dressed in something corporate. It does go without saying, but just because you are virtually interviewing doesn't mean you can wear your pajamas or a hoodie or look a little bit more relaxed. Those first impressions really do count. So you need to make sure you're presenting yourself overall in a professional manner, nice and neat and tidy, whether that is in person or virtual. In addition to researching about the company, it's always good to be prepared with some answers before your interview. You want to be able to highlight your confidence as much as possible, your ability to work under pressure, and your knowledge of the duties of the role that you're interviewing for. It's always really good to answer a question with practical and competency-based examples. So some of the methods that we use are the STAR and SAO method. So these are great ones to reference, and there's many websites online that will show you, as well as on our People2People website, about what these STAR and SAO methods are. But you need to make sure that you have examples that are going to highlight your experience and strength. So show that you can use and add value to the team. The interview is a chance for you to really sell your experience. So you want to be able to give those real life examples of how you've done a particular duty and what your day-to-day looked like. So make sure you know your resume in and out. However, go into more detail on how you did a particular type of duty, not just listing off what was involved within your role. You want to overall be able to highlight achievements within the business and go into a little bit more detail so the person who's interviewing you gets a really good understanding about how you would operate if you were within their team. I guess next thing, it's always important, but never discuss salary within an interview, or at least don't be the first person to bring it up. You want to make sure you're highlighting your experience and what you can bring to the interview. If you're ever interviewing with us through People2People, we'll always represent you and let you know what the salary is prior to the interview, and we'll help with handling that. But it's always good in an interview to focus on highlighting your strengths and your experience and have those salary discussions after the interview. Finally, and most important thing is to have some questions prepared. Most likely than not, you will be asked at the end of an interview, do you have any questions? So it's good to have something prepared, because this is your chance to, again, highlight your experience and, have that connection with the hiring manager. So don't be afraid. As a general point, and we always encourage candidates to ask the hiring manager a question back. So whether it be about their experience in the business, what they enjoy working about with the company, why they're still working there, it gives the client a chance to end the interview on a more positive note. And talk about something from their own perspective, which is what they're going to be most comfortable about as well. So definitely have a couple of questions prepared. That way, at the end of the interview, you're not, left without anything. And if you have any final queries, you can ask within that point. Finally, and I guess biggest thing is obviously say thank you. Someone's taken their time out of their day to meet with you. So it's always good and important, at the end, to thank them for their time and that you're looking forward to hearing from them. So that's all from me. Biggest things, I guess, for us is just confidence. Be prepared within an interview and make sure you've done your research. It will definitely assist with your job search, and having that connection and meeting the hiring managers in person is definitely a really big advantage at the moment in the market. So we are encouraging everybody to meet in person as much as possible and just enjoy the process as well. Interviews can be a little bit daunting at times for either party. So have fun, be yourself, and highlight your experience.
There we go. Sorry. Great. Thank you, Maddie. Some really good tips and advice there. There's lots of resources across the internet, but on the People2People website, we have an interview centre, which has, I guess, gives a lot more depth and perhaps some interview questions and more of an explanation of some of those things that Maddie went through. So you're very welcome to go and have a look at that if you think that would be helpful for you. So the last person who we'll go to speak to, and then we'll certainly take some questions. I can see there's been questions coming through as we've been going, is we're going to talk to Farah, who's really going to give us some ideas around what you do after the interview and what some of the steps that you should take to maximise your chances of securing that opportunity. So we'll go to you now, Farah.
Thanks, Kath. So now you may be thinking the interview is done. So what's next? You may have many other questions after the interview, like how do I negotiate and accept an offer? What is the best way to resign from my current job? And how do I prepare for my first day? So I have 6 steps for you just to narrow it down. And particularly if you are working with a recruitment agency like P2People, what is the best approach and what is best practice? And it is to take one step at a time. So firstly, you want to confirm your interest for this position. After the interview, you will have a much clearer idea of the role and the organization. So take the time and reflect on the interview and work out if the role on offer meets what you are looking for. You want to promptly pass this feedback along to your consultant, including some details as to why you are or may not be interested in the role. So then if your interviewer has provided you with the contact details, this leads me to the next step, which would be to send a follow-up email. You can send a brief email by thanking them for their time and confirming your interest in the position. Again, the whole impression starts from the beginning of your job search right through to the end. It's best practice probably not to contact them directly for the feedback, as your People2People consultant will manage this process for you, or the interviewer will get back to you as well. Now, the next stage is really selecting and briefing your references. It is just as important as every other stage, if not more important. So before you embark on any job search, you should really identify at least 2 referees and ask if they are prepared to act as your referees. Your referees need to be people you have worked closely with, at least in the last 5 years, and generally someone who has been your direct manager. Now, once you get to that reference stage, contact them and let them know who will be contacting them. It is a good idea to give them an overview of the role you are applying for, so they have some time to think about your past experiences and they can give the right answers to highlight your most relevant strengths. Then the next step would be generally negotiating and accepting an offer. Now, this stage can be quite daunting, yet exciting for a lot. So ensure you do take your time every step of the way. The first thing you want to do is be open and transparent, particularly if you're working with a consultant. Generally, you will have agreed on a target salary for that position at the beginning of the process. But if your expectations somehow change as you explore the role further, it is important you discuss this with them every step of the way. This is what they do every day. So if you can be confident in them to negotiate and be a part of that process for you, it would be most beneficial. The more information now your consultant has, the better prepared they will be to get you the best outcome. Now, many roles, though, do have fixed salary ranges from which employers cannot really budge. Even if they really wanted to, if they had a magic wand, they would give you everything that they possibly could. Now, if you're working with a consultant, they will advise you on this throughout the process. So if you interview for a role on the understanding that it offers a particular salary, you should be prepared to accept that salary when you get to that stage. It's honestly best practice not to interview for a role paying well below your salary expectations and then try to negotiate it up. It does get frustrating and it doesn't set a good impression. Now, the second part to this is to consider the whole package. Try not to just focus on salary. And James did touch on this before. Think about what is important to you and consider how the role on offer meets those needs. Things like flexibility, proximity to home, career development, and company culture, they are just as huge benefits as that salary. Finally, once you have received an offer, it is a reasonable time of 24 hours to think about that offer that has been made. If you have any questions or concerns, it's best to speak to somebody about them. Once you have accepted the offer, your consultant or your interviewer will make sure that you're getting it in writing. So don't resign. Absolutely don't resign from your current position until you have received this written confirmation, which then leads me to my next step, which is resigning from your current job. Now, there are a few stages in this process, so try and keep engaged. Before you resign, make sure you are 100% committed to going through with it. If you are leaving simply, again, because of what James said, for a pay rise or a senior role, you should talk to your manager about this before even looking. Generally, they can try and support you to get that best possible outcome. And you need to ask yourself why it took the resignation for them to value your contributions on the other hand as well. So there's a lot of factors at play. You want to also review your contract. You actually want to review your contract and check your required notice period at the same time and make sure you're not bound by any non-compete clauses. Notice periods are generally 2 to 4 weeks, but they can vary. The best practice for when resigning, though, is to put it in writing. Your letter should be professional, it should be polite, and state your notice period and intended end date. You don't need to offer a reason for your resignation, but you can if you think it is appropriate. Just be sure to steer clear of any emotional reasons. It is important that you do resign face-to-face, meeting with your manager, not by phone, not by email. Arrange that meeting during which you can offer your resignation letter. And depending on the situation and your relationship, you can go into more details. Be sure, though, to ask your manager if they are prepared to act as a referee for you. It is ideal to get a written recommendation that details your strengths and your contributions that you made during your time at the organization. Make sure, though, over the years, you do make contact with those who you use as a referee, especially if you've been in a role for, say, 8 years and the next role that you want to go for requires 2 referees of direct managers that you've reported to. Now, finally, this is the last stage, and it is absolutely the most exciting. You've got the job, and it's time to start preparing for the new role. Now, a good departure always sets the scene for a great beginning in your new role. And as your start date approaches, it's time to start thinking about your attire for the first weeks. I know you're always thinking about what you want to wear on your first day. Now, as a guide, though, wear similar attire to what you wore in your interview. Once you are in your role, you will be able to gauge suitable day-to-day attire for your new organization. During the first week, do check in with your people-to-people consultant if you're working with us and let them know how you're settling in. It's always best to keep engaged. Thanks, Kath.
Thank you, Farah. Very comprehensive, and I think a lot of good advice and insights for people there. So, yeah, as I said, there is an interview centre that is on the People to People website that will, I guess, give you a little bit more detail about all of the pieces of advice that the team has shared with you. What I will do is I might just take some questions which I've seen have been popping up as we've been going along, and I'll do my best to answer them, or I might call out some of the team if I think you guys would be better equipped. So I'm just having a quick look through some of the questions that have come through here. So we've got a question from Thomas that's, with the market as busy as it is at the moment, how difficult would you say it is for a recent graduate student to break into their desired industry? Good question, and thank you for the question, Thomas. I think look, it really depends on what you are a graduate in and what industry you're trying to get into, because some industries are really, very hungry, I guess, for new graduates, and there's lots of opportunities, whereas others are very, very competitive, and it's very difficult to get that first step. And once you get the first step, you know, the platform's pretty significant. So I guess the general advice that I would give is to be as open-minded as you can be when you're considering that very first career step. And personally, I would be thinking more so at that graduate level around what learning opportunities will there be for me with this potential opportunity, what mentoring relationships might I be able to develop, what industry experience does it give me, what your salary is and benefits. That would, I mean, obviously everyone's got minimum standards that they need to meet, but that would be secondary. If you've got limited work experience, which you probably do have if you're a graduate, it would be really about demonstrating and showcasing the skills that you've got that perhaps have been through studies or through casual work you may have done through studies that would then be transferable, or maybe even some of the work that you've done in your studies that mean that you've got a desirable skill set. So it can be hard to get that first step in, but my broad advice would be fairly open with what you consider. What else have we got that's come through here? This is an interesting one from Isabel. So her question is that after being declined a pay rise at the end of this year, I've decided to look around for something different that pays more. I'm not sure where to start in this process or how to handle it with my current employer. That's a good question. I think, so some of the things that the team have covered, I think would be in terms of how you start your potential new job search. I think there's been some things that have been outlined, particularly from James. Without knowing your dynamic with your manager, I think if you were in my team, I would want to know what it is that you're looking for. Obviously, you're looking for a salary increase, but also what are your more broad career goals? Where are you working towards? Give your employer an opportunity to give you that, or at least you show them the respect of saying, this is what I'm looking for. This is these are my career goals. And importantly, this is what you offer to the organisation. You know, it obviously needs to be a two-way street there, particularly when you're asking for a salary increase. It's need to, you know, demonstrate value. And if they're not able to offer you that, then I think you can then just go about looking for an opportunity in another area. It's difficult, as I said, not knowing the dynamic between you and your particular manager. But if your reason for looking for something new is purely around not getting the salary increase, to what James said before, I'd really try to, as uncomfortable as those conversations can be, try to have that conversation to see if you can get a salary increase. But if there are other factors that, you know, maybe you're considering and maybe you think somewhere else might give you around culture or progression or training or whatever, then it might be time to consider something new. What else has come through here? Okay, and I'm going to throw this to one of the team if anyone particularly wants to jump in, otherwise I'll call you out. So this is from Naya. It says, do you think interviews will move back to being more preferred to have face-to-face than virtual? And if so, do you think I would have less of a chance at the job in question if I were to prefer the online interview instead? So I guess, is it a disadvantage to opt for an online interview over a face-to-face interview? Guys, would any of you like to jump in and answer that question?
I can, who wants to go? I can jump in quickly and then I guess James can give his opinion too. So definitely I think it is moving towards interviewing face-to-face now. If speed's not a factor and location and you have that ability to meet someone in person, we're definitely encouraging that. Workplaces are flexible, but they are wanting staff to come in and have more of a collaborative approach. So if you have the option to interview face-to-face, definitely take it. If you can't interview face-to-face and a reason is asked as to why, really good to have, I guess, an understanding if it's a location, it will take you too long to get there, or what the reason may be. If a business is going to want you to work in the office some days, but you're only able to interview virtually, it will be, questioned as to why that is. So if you have the option to interview face-to-face, we're definitely encouraging that now. But I'm sure James as well can give more of his perspective on this.
Yeah, I'd recommend being open to the face-to-face. What I'm seeing on permanent process is the first round typically is a virtual conversation, purely from a speed point of view, and just to hear how the sort of combination goes between the candidate and employer. And then that second interview is an opportunity for both parties to get to know each other better, and also for the candidate to get a feel of the organisation, the location, the office. So I'd strongly recommend anyone who's in a a second round interview process to follow through on the opportunity to meet your potential manager face to face, because that's someone who's ultimately you're going to be partnering with on the next step in your career.
Great. Yeah, I'd echo the responses of both of the guys there. I'm just looking because there's some sort of similar themes in some of these questions. This is quite a specific question though that's come through, that is, does it give a better impression for me to contact the employer directly after my job interview, or does it look more professional to go through my consultant instead? And that's, I guess, assuming you're working with a recruitment consultant. Farah, I might get you to answer that one, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the point here is, if you're wanting to reach out to the potential employer for feedback, then it wouldn't be best practice to reach out to them directly. If you want to express your interest and confirm that you are interested in the role and you want to thank them for their time, then it's absolutely okay to reach out to them and say thank you through that email. But again, wait for that feedback to come to you from them. But also, if you're being represented by a consultant, your consultant will give you that feedback as well when appropriate. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thanks, Farah. One of the things, so if an employer is working with a recruitment agency such as ours, even just from an efficiency perspective, they'll have one conversation with feedback, perhaps about 2 or 3 candidates, rather than, with you and then with the next person, then with the next person. So yeah, always best to come through the recruitment consultant. But echoing what Farah said, saying thank you, expressing interest, that's absolutely fine. There's been a couple of general questions around breaking into the Australian workforce if you don't, the theme is sort of if you don't have that local experience, and then there's some questions around visas, that sort of thing, which are probably a little bit too specific. But the broad advice that I would give, if you are trying to translate your experience from another location and you don't have any local Australian experience, and it varies depending on the type of role that you do in the particular sector that you work in, but sometimes, so I think one of the questions was around human resources, and I think one was around property as well. Sometimes there will be specific local regulation and legislation that you would be required to understand and be across if you're to work as a professional in that particular role within Australia. So if you don't have that local experience, and of course, how do you get it if you don't get an opportunity? But to help you to get that first step in, my advice would be to demonstrate what you've done to master the local landscape. So it might be, so if you're a human resources professional, if you don't have local Australian knowledge or local Australian experience, I should say, that you may have done a course around getting up to speed with the local legislation, or it might be in property, you've done a course that just gets you across whatever the particular regulations are within Australia. So that can just help to overcome that hesitation from employers that you won't, even though you might have the skills required, you might not necessarily have the technical kind of understanding. The other thing that I would say that, and I really do understand it can be frustrating and difficult to get that first step in, any experience that you can get to give you that sort of step into the local market is really valuable. So it may mean that you might do some voluntary work. You are more likely to get an opportunity in that situation if you do work directly with an employer. I think we've mentioned a couple of times that if an employer engages a recruitment consultant, they usually have a pretty clear list of criteria, and they look for us to be to match that very closely. Whereas if you've got a lot of potential and they see that potential, but you might have sort of 3 out of the 5 things, they might be more likely to give you that opportunity if it's not through a third party like a recruitment consultant. So yeah, that's just a couple of pieces of information. The other thing, just to some of the questions that have been around sort of visas and getting that work opportunity, when you're making your applications, if it's unclear what your working rights are, I think it's good to be specific about that. So if you may not, you may have only recently perhaps moved here, but you've got full working rights, be specific on your application around what your visa class is and what your working rights are. There's a lot of applications, just making it easier for the person who's reviewing your application is helpful as well. The skilled migration is definitely something that's also on the agenda in the political world as well. So I think one of the questions was, does Australia have programs to support that? There are some, but it's certainly on the agenda, I know, in the political discourse. So that's some advice there. What else is there? Yeah, that was about foreign workers. I think most of the other questions are, and there's been more that have come in, but they're relatively probably aligned to some of the things that we've covered already, and I'm mindful we're getting close to 20 past 1. So unless there's anything else that's burning, I think hopefully that's been helpful for everybody. As I said, I direct you to the resources on our website. If you are looking for work, which I suspect you might be if you're joining us today, all of our roles are currently advertised on our website, so please have a look, and if you see something that you've got the relevant experience for, the contact details of the recruitment consultant managing that will be there as well. So that's our website, people2people.com.au/Sydney, to get to opportunities in Sydney. All of our socials are there too. Please follow us. There's a lot of content that hopefully will be helpful for you. Yeah, happy New Year. I hope 2023 starts well for you and everyone has a nice summer period. And thanks again for taking the time to join us.